Right. Our final paper this afternoon is being presented by, and my iPad keeps flipping, James Pedlar, who is Assistant Professor of Wesley Studies and Theology at Tyndale Seminary. And he is presenting a paper, and I've had breakfast with him, so it's going to be really interesting. I'm not going to tip him off to the magic mushrooms and stuff like that. A Sign of the Latter-day Glory, Hugh Bourne on Women Preachers. So a nice segue.
Thank you. Yes, I'm thankful for the invitation and for the opportunity I had to do this research 2 years ago as a visiting fellow in Manchester. Hugh Bourne was the co-founder of the Primitive Methodist Connection, a revivalistic body that broke away from the Wesleyan Methodists in the early 19th century and eventually went on to become the second largest British Methodist body going into the Union of 1932. Borne and his co-founder William Close were revival leaders in Staffordshire who were expelled by the Wesleyans in 1808, ostensibly for their involvement in camp meetings. Although there were larger social, political, and I would argue theological issues beneath the surface. Another dividing line between Wesleyan Methodists and revivalists such as Borne was the preaching ministry of women. Women preachers had become increasingly common in the late 18th century in Methodism, but as we've just heard, there was a motion passed at the conference in 1803 by those who were opposed, greatly curtailing and sort of condemning the public ministry of women in preaching. Although, as John Lenton has shown, many women ignored that decision and continued to preach in various contexts in Wesleyan Methodism for decades after that happened. The revivalist, so this decision, regardless of how effective it was indicative of this trend in Wesleyan Methodism that's well documented in the 19th century towards a high view of the pastoral office and as more of a centralized authority in the connection. And that's been well traced by many scholars. The revivalist branches of Methodism in Britain, on the other hand, continue to support the preaching ministry of women. So Hugh Bourne's views on this matter were outlined in his 1808 tract, Remarks on the Ministry of Women. The tract is not groundbreaking, and it's very brief, but it's still significant because it's only the second published tract specifically defending women's ministry by a Methodist, the first being Zechariah Taft's first tract, which was published in 1803. So typically scholars have noted the similarities between Taft and Bourne, and indeed there are a number of parallels between the two. The key difference, however, is that Bourne does not follow Taft or Bosanquet or Wesley in presenting women's ministry as an extraordinary thing. And I'm going to seek to sort of explain the significance of that difference in light of Bourne's views on ministry. Okay, so first, it's useful to set this tract in the context of Bourne's life and ministry, because I don't assume that many of you know much about him. He was converted in 1799, and starting around 1801, he became involved in the leadership of this local revival around Heresy Head, based primarily in cottage prayer meetings. And his involvement in these revival efforts sort of went unnoticed by the circuit and connexional authorities until he and some compatriots decided to hold these camp meetings, spurred on by the visit of the recent visit of the eccentric American evangelist Lorenzo Dow. So the first camp meeting was held May 31st, 1807 on Malcop. The 1807 conference meeting in Liverpool declared camp meetings to be highly improper in England and disowned any connection with them. Nevertheless, Bourne and his colleagues felt that camp meetings were an important means of grace, and they held several more throughout 1807 and 1808. The situation was about to come to a head just as Bourne was writing his tract on women in ministry. In fact, he wrote the tract on June 21st, 1808, and he was expelled from the quarterly meeting of the Burslem quarterly meeting on June 27th, so less than a week after he wrote his tract. although he wasn't there and they didn't know what he had done, but this just was all happening at the same time. Bourne was deeply offended by this exclusion. However, he had always had a very loose relationship to the Wesleyan Methodist connection. And he conducted his revival without any help from the local itinerants. Whenever, however, his compatriots established a new group of converts, they would link them into the local Wesleyan Methodist circuit. Now, yesterday morning, some of us attended the session on evangelical networks, and David Hart was talking about the difference between the informal but strong networks and formal but weak networks that are characterized by strong leadership. By the time Bourne wrote this 1808 tract, he was much more deeply enmeshed in an informal network of revivalists in his area than he was in the Wesleyan Methodist connection. What is more, his revivalist friends were the leaders of the emerging independent Methodist churches who had already separated from the Wesleyan Methodist connection. So these associations actually went back to 1804 in Congleton, when Bourne had a powerful sanctification experience under the ministry of some independent revivalist from Stockport. And then after his first Malcop camp meeting, Bourne visited the so-called Magic Methodist leader, James Crawfoot, who was then a local Wesleyan Methodist preacher, but whose radical mystical spirituality and preaching in Quaker Methodist pulpits would lead to his expulsion in 1810. Now, Crawford introduced Bourne to Peter and Hannah Phillips, leaders of the Quaker Methodists in the Warrington area. And Bourne would continue to spend a great deal of time with Crawford and the Phillips in the ensuing months leading up to his writing of his tract. He also had a close relationship with John Beresford, central figure in the Macclesfield Independent Methodists, and many of those people supported the camp meetings. So these ties were so strong that even before his expulsion, Bourne had attended the annual meetings, which is what the independents called their conferences, of the Independent Methodists in 1807 and 1808. And in fact, the tract that he wrote was in response to a discussion at the Independent Methodist Conference on June 12, 1808. And he was tasked with writing this response to the questions that had emerged about women in ministry. So linking all of these influences together was that American Lorenzo Dow, who had stayed with the Quaker Methodists, Peter and Hannah Phillips, between 1805 and 1807 while he was campaigning in northwest England and in Ireland. Dow, as many of you will know, was a very irregular Methodist, sometimes branded a Quaker evangelist, who basically worked freelance and saw no need for ecclesiastical oversight of his ministry. Bourne heard Dow preach at Heresy Head in April of 1807, and that had provided the initial, the sort of immediate impetus for the first camp meeting. Now, if we turn to the contents of Bourne's tract, he begins by claiming that he and those in his circle really have not studied the issue in detail because they wanted to avoid, quote, useless controversy, and they believed they should just support anyone who was of good character and whose ministry was owned by the Lord. In a familiar revivalist vein, he wrote, "Instead of stopping to reason about various things, we find it best to be pressing on." The argument of the tract begins with Joel 2:28, which promises that the prophetic spirit will be poured out on both sons and daughters. Bourne then appeals to John Parkhurst's lexicons and a sermon by Adam Clarke in support of his claim that, quote, a prophet was simply one who was employed in the service of God, and that, whether as one that sung the praises of God or one that preached, exhorted, instructed the people, and these last were said to preach the gospel. And then, following a familiar pattern, Bourne proceeds to answer a series of 8 objections to women's public preaching. Most of the objections are answered with examples from women from both testaments who, Bourne says, were prophesying, according to his definition, in response to a commission of the Holy Ghost. Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, Mary, Elizabeth, the woman of Samaria, not to mention Mary Magdalene, who was commissioned by Christ himself, and therefore who had been ordained an apostle to the apostles, a preacher to the preachers, an evangelist to the evangelists. Like others before him, Bourne emphasizes Paul's instructions regarding women's head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11 as a decisive proof that female prophecy was practiced in the primitive church. And in response to those two problematic texts in 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2, Bourne suggests it doesn't make sense to suppose that Paul was contradicting himself in banning something that he had just regulated in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. But then he shies away from providing a definitive sort of interpretation of those texts, only noting that some friends have informed him that they may apply to church discipline. It may mean that women should not ordain men, as that would imply usurping authority. The final three objections deal again with the meaning of the word prophecy, and 2 Timothy 2:2's instruction to commit the same to faithful men, which Bourne says could easily be translated faithful persons. Then toward the end of the tract, he emphasizes the fruits of the ministry as a decisive test. He writes, "You have seen many instances wherein the Lord has set his seal to a woman's ministry by converting sinners to himself. Now, would it not have been hard to have hindered these persons' salvation?" And then he cites Mary Bosanquet as an example, and John Wesley's letter, which he's aware of, although from what we know, he wouldn't have been able to read her letter. So that couldn't have been a source for his tract. Incidentally, he traveled to Madeley on April 3rd of 1808, not long before he wrote the tract, to hear Mary Bosanquet, and he attended her class. And he spoke very highly of her as a woman of faith, although he criticized the class, and he said, we have classes whose religion is deeper, whose faith is stronger, and who are much more given up to God, as he wrote in his journal. Of course, in the public tract, he makes no such comment, but he ends by suggesting that all the objections are summed up in the claim that women are the weaker vessel, but this, he says, speaks in favor of their preaching, since God chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Another familiar move. He concludes, as God chose the ministry of women under darker dispensations, it would be strange if they are incapable of ministering on account of their being weaker vessels. Now the gospel shines with a brighter light. So, if you've read other arguments defending women's ministry, you'll know that these are familiar approaches. And the only sources that Bourne has acknowledged explicitly in his tract is Parkhurst's lexicons and this Adam Clarke sermon from 1800 from the Methodist magazine. But his arguments are close to Zechariah Taft, and so many people have speculated as to whether he had read Taft's first tract from 1803. In addition to drawing on many of the same biblical examples of women preachers, both focus on the meaning of prophecy. Both rely on Adam Clarke's interpretation of prophecy. Taft also uses Joel 2:28, although it's a little less centered on that text than Bourne's tract is. He does discuss it, unlike Mary Bosanquet, who didn't bring Joel 2:28 into that 1771 letter, although, as we've heard, she was a very charismatic person. Taft also emphasizes the importance of the fruit of women's ministry as proof of its validity, although he's a little more cautious than Bourne, and he speaks of it as presumptive, though not necessarily positive proof. Taft's biblical arguments are broader than Bourne's, and he includes more post-biblical sources, including a section focused on John Wesley's position. Bourne only mentions Wesley briefly in passing when he mentions his letter to Mary Bosanquet. The most significant difference, however, between Bourne and Taft is that Bourne makes no reference to women's preaching as being an extraordinary thing. Taft's argument was very careful and moderate, as articulated in his thesis, and he says this: the argument is that God did in the primitive church and does to this day occasionally call, qualify, and commission his handmaids or daughters to prophesy, that is, to preach in his name. The qualifier occasionally signifies his acceptance of this distinction between ordinary and extraordinary ministry, as does his inclusion of Mary Bosanquet's letter and John Wesley's reply in his 1820 tract. He also cautioned women preachers who met opposition, above all, do not attempt to speak at those seasons or in those places where the regular preachers preach, but rather speak in some private house to those who are willing to hear you, and at a time when there is no meeting in the neighborhood. The 1820 tract concluded with the cautious statement that female preaching in some extraordinary cases, and this is all I contend for, is both reasonable and lawful and consonant to Scripture and the practice of the primitive times. Bourne, on the other hand, had a very low view of the ministerial office. And so he's more radically open to female preaching than Taft. Where Bourne differs from Taft's argument, he's closer to the Quaker Margaret Fell's argument in her 1666 tract, Women Speaking Justified. Now, had Bourne read Fell's tract, there's no direct evidence, though we know he had been reading Quaker writings since before his conversion, and we know he's been spending a lot of time with these Quaker Methodists in the year leading up to the writing of the tract. It could be that he picked up some of these arguments from his conversations with them. Indeed, the draft of the tract was written while he was staying at the Phillips home. And so you can imagine they were talking about it as he was preparing to write his tract. Now, both Bourne and Fell begin their tracts with that quotation of Joel 2:28, although Fell begins her actual argument with creation in the image of God as a basis for the fundamental equality of men and women. Fell emphasizes that those who speak in the power of the Spirit speak with the power of Christ, and therefore should not be resisted. Bourne's tract does not reference the Spirit as often, though his account of prophecy presupposes the Spirit's commissioning and seal upon the prophet. However, Bourne's manuscript journal from this time is filled with discussion of the Spirit and various spiritual manifestations. Indeed, he claims he wrote this tract almost by impression, meaning that the Spirit moved him as he was writing with direct leading. On the question of ministry, both Bourne and Fell thought along charismatic lines, and like Lorenzo Dow, they really left no room for ecclesiastical oversight of the personal discernment of the Spirit. Regarding his own call to ministry, Bourne claimed later in life that he was raised into a preacher from the moment he preached his first sermon on July the 12th, 1801, resulting in one convert. If Bourne was made a preacher by the Spirit's gift and by that seal of his ministry, then why couldn't a woman be made a preacher in exactly the same way? Bourne and Fell made no reference to women's preaching as an extraordinary ministry because neither had much respect for the ordinary ministry. For Fell, ministers in established churches were blind priests who made their living by preaching upon the prophetic utterances of women in the Bible and yet refusing to let women speak in church.
Hear, hear.
Now, Bourne was not quite so harsh in his judgments, although he often criticized the traveling preachers of Wesleyan Methodism, those who were beginning to assume that mantle of the pastoral office, for their failures in preaching and example. As far back as 1803, he wrote this in his journal: "For the future, I propose as much as I conveniently can to avoid the company of the greater part of the preachers." This was a common bond between him and his revivalist compatriots. All of the nascent independent Methodist groups Bourne was connected with were led by local preachers and class leaders who had revolted against the authority of the itinerants and established themselves as lay-led bodies with no paid ministry. It was not until around 1811 that Bourne decided in favor of accepting some paid preachers. And this was the main reason that he eventually parted ways with these independent Methodists. For Bourne, the decision was primarily pragmatic rather than theological. The growth of the movement had reached a point where it just made sense to pool some connectional funds and to free up some people for missions work and expanding the connection. Though initially only 2 preachers were paid, though there were many more who were itinerating, and some, like Bourne, continued to live on their own means. And even further, in early primitive Methodist polity, the difference between the traveling preacher and the local preacher was simply a description of their movements. There was no sense of a hierarchy between those 2 roles, and people often moved between them. And just as there were some unpaid traveling preachers, there were some paid local preachers. So the difference was very much relativized. In fact, Bourne had a relatively low view of preaching in general. His early revival proceeded mostly through what was called conversation preaching. That is, personal evangelism, which was expected of all the people. Even when it came to preaching in the traditional sense, Bourne frequently warned against the evils of what he called long speeching. He wanted short sermons followed by extended prayer meetings where everyone could participate. In 1802, he built a chapel, largely at his own expense, in Heresy Head to support his new community. And then it was added to the circuit plan. And his reflections on that are interesting. He says this: preaching was appointed in it for 10 and 2 every Sunday. This was overdoing it. The work had been raised up chiefly by means of pious conversation and prayer meetings. And so very much preaching at such a place and under such circumstances seemed to not have a good effect. It seemed to hinder the exertions of the people, and the revival soon made a pause. The prayer meetings of Bourne's early ministry were loud and boisterous and marked by the participation of all present and prayers offered in loud shouts of ecstasy and praise. These took place in the home, where women would have felt more freedom to speak than they might have in a chapel. Moreover, Bourne had been very impressed by some of the female visionaries he had encountered amongst these so-called magic Methodists, and in that context he had seen James Crawford turn the meeting over to some of these women while they were in trances. So in a variety of ways, the dividing line between personal evangelism, public prayer, exhortation, prophecy, preaching was all relativized and fluid. And the question of licensing preaching really wasn't raised. The lack of distinction between ordinary and extraordinary ministry meant that there was one less barrier to women's preaching in Bourne's circles. Finally, Bourne and Fell also brought eschatological expectancy to their accounts of women's preaching. Though Fell's tract is decidedly more apocalyptic, she believed the church had been living under the reign of the beast for centuries, and that this rise of this true spirituality among the Friends was a sign of a new age dawning. Bourne's tract was a lot more tame, but in his unpublished journal at this time, we find a lot of apocalyptic imagery and visions that he were mediated sometimes through this through the influence of James Crawford. However, in the 1821 Primitive Methodist magazine, Bourne published letters from William O'Brien, founder of the Bible Christians, a very similar revivalistic Methodist group from Cornwall, detailing the rise of female preaching in that body. Bourne's preface to O'Brien's letter strikes an expectant eschatological tone. He says, "What chiefly marks the great promise in Joel is the increase of prophesying. And as the latter-day glory more and more approaches, these exercises will be more and more abundant. The great promise will be fully established. In the latter part of the promise, which respects daughters and handmaidens prophesying or preaching, a remarkable coincidence has taken place in our connection, and in the connection which arose in Cornwall. It is really surprising that the two connections, without any knowledge of each other, should each, nearly at the same time, be led in the same way as it respects the ministry of women. Both connections employed women as exhorters and as local and traveling preachers." So Bourne believed the Spirit was at work in a special way in his time, and that the preaching ministry of women was a sure sign that the final consummation was on its way. Although the historical trends among primitive Methodists moved in the opposite direction, he was expecting female preaching to increase more and more. Thank you.
All right, in the tradition that has now been established, I will open with a question. Do you have any sense of how many women were preaching in the primitive Methodist connections and in these circuits?
Yes, Dorothy Graham, I think is her name, who's done definitive work on that.
Right.
And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but she did her dissertation on that subject, and then she has a website actually where you can search biographical information on all the primitive Methodist preachers. It was, I mean, it wasn't anything like parody, but it was more than other connections. I don't remember exactly. Yeah. But it did, like in many of these groups, it faded after
Right.
the first generation.
Open for questions.
Well, just your final comment there perhaps answers my question. But as the Primitives and the Bible Christians moved to Methodist union with the Wesleyans in the 20th century, by that time had women preachers amongst Primitives and Bible Christians receded to the point where the sort of the Wesleyan model of prohibition of women became the prevailing model. You or someone else in the room might be able to reflect on that later period.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to my colleagues from the UK, but I think it was basically faded by then. I don't know there were any primitive Methodists ministers.
Because if that is the case, that's an interesting pattern, isn't it? Because there's a parallel in the New Testament itself, or in the New Testament period, or the immediate post-New Testament period, where there's this flaring up of a radical doctrine of the Spirit's anointing on women. And then you read early church fathers and all these explanations why women should not preach. So you get this radical burst, and then you get a taming of that, and a kind of a more patriarchal sort of construct begins to control it, and you can see the same kind of pattern re-emerging. I mean, in the Church of the Nazarene in 1910 or something like that, I read somewhere that in a district like Tennessee, 30 to 50% of the ordained ministers were women, and now that might be 1%.
Right.
So it's just this tragic kind
Same
of
thing in
pattern
Pentecostalism.
of an initial burst followed by a taming down and almost disappearing.
Well, and I don't, again, have the exact details, but it may be connected to their embrace of ordination, which wasn't an issue at this time, right? And even Hugh Bourne never called himself reverend. He was the venerable Hugh Bourne.
There was just to your point, there was a anthology by female church historians some time ago, I guess in the 90s when I first, and it went through each denomination, or many denominations, and traced that same pattern. So first the outpouring of the Spirit allows women as well as men to preach, and then to me it's a little bit like Judges when the people said, we want to be like everybody else and we want a king and we don't want a judge. And so as it becomes more and more conventionalized, that people wanted their denomination to look like other ones with male headship and leadership, and then ordination of course is a major issue.
Yeah, female preaching declines in primitive Methodism, but it continues continuously. It never dies out. In fact, David's done some research recently to show, in the case of Sophia Chambers, who founded the Holiness Church in Britain, that she was influenced through primitive Methodism, and she founded a Holiness Church. So there's still the, and then some of it also is transferred into the deaconess orders that are founded in all the Methodist branches.
And would they have been local preachers or traveling? Do you know? That would be interesting.
They weren't assigned in that that sort of
they
structure.
weren't part of the structure, right?
In Pentecostalism, they're almost always evangelists.
Right.
And then later, plant churches, and then once that gets established, it's given to a man. Any other questions? Yes.
So, in the earlier time, the rise of women preachers what was their path in? They didn't have a high, regard for the structures. So what was their, what I'm saying? What was their path in? I assume it'd be the same as men. Was it must have been some communal affirmation of their prophetic capacities? I mean,
you mean in the primitive Methodists?
Yeah, the primitive Methodists.
Yeah.
So how was the door open to them? Because that's one of the questions of today is how do you get doors open to them?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the details of the mechanics of that. But given the way they engaged in worship in their prayer meetings, I mean, opportunities for speaking would be pretty common, right? So
like a Quaker sort of model in some ways.
Yeah.
Maybe. And so then it would just evolve and be
maybe David knows.
The process is much the same as it was in early Wesleyanism. In that case, of course, in terms of men only. in that you're absolutely right. There was a kind of, because acclamatus, there was a sense in which the exhorter would be encouraged. Certainly true in Primitive Methodism, and equally true in the Bible Christian movement. My comment is going to be about the Bible Christians. Two things to say. One is that, of course, their genesis is considerably different from the Primitives, as you will be aware. They were not a reaction against Wesleyanism. They actually filled the Methodist vacuum where there was no Wesleyanism. They weren't actually a Cornish denomination.
Or at
Devon.
Devon.
From North Devon.
Yes. Right.
And it's geographically quite significant. I think the other thing to say is that within one generation, there was already strong resistance to women preachers in the Bible Christian movement. There was a wonderful entry in the Bible Christian Archive in the actual record office from Mary Thorne, her brother-in-law. And incidentally, the qualification for being a preacher of any description in the early Bible Christian movement, you have to be called Thorne. As long as you're called Thorne, you read. But on a slightly more serious note, there's a wonderful letter in which she asks the questions as she describes what it's like to perambulate to and from the appointments in the winter. Do our boots not get as muddy as yours? Do our skirts not become as splattered as yours? Are we no different from you? And the answer is yes, actually you are, and we're not going to have you anymore. But
Thank you, it's very helpful.
Other questions or comments?
Can you talk a little bit more about the publication history of the tract?
Yeah, I don't think, as far as I know, there's no extant copies. It was published in Walford, his biography of Hugh Bourne, and that's the only place I've been able to find it. Although in Paul Chilcote's new anthology, he gives the bibliographical information of the original, and I don't know if he had it, but as far as I know, I haven't been able to track it down. I don't know if anyone knows, but I don't know. I don't know how big of a circulation it had. I doubt it had much, but yeah.
There's evidence that it was.
But it was published, yes.
But hasn't survived.
It was published, but as far as I know, has not survived.
Not in the Primitive. Never appeared in the Primitive Methodist magazine.
I don't know.
Okay.
No, there's a few other things on women in ministry, but not that tract. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Is there any indication that women were used because of their novelty value? Because quite often in the archives you get the women who are pioneering new areas. In the Methodist archives there's a couple of letters in which he said that they actually brought out the crowns.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
And after that area had been pioneered, then the women were shifted sideways and then took over.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, I think that was part of it. And in the early, they had this one particular female evangelist, Mary Dunnell, in the early days, who was just sort of a known. She became this sort of famous person in the area for her preaching, and so I think they tried to get her to the camp meetings because they knew she would bring some people, right? And then there was a falling out not long after, but. They also used child preachers, and probably had the same thing. Boy preachers, probably the same kind of rationale.
We had a lot of girl preachers in Pentecostalism. Same thing. Anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah, well, all that's left is to thank the speakers and all of you.